Special. Violette1st, 2023 Halloween Special. Introduction. Hello and welcome to another Violette1st story. This a Halloween special where Bill tries to raise the dead, ruin Violette's Halloween party, bring suffering to Mount Airy while trick-or-treating and making a part of Mount Airy uninhabitable. Main characters, Violette, Bill and William. Violette is the mother, Bill is the father. William is Violette and Bill's teenage son. One quick thing, if I refer to something called the boys, I am referring to Bill and William. I am using this as a shorter term. That is all I have to say. Enjoy the story. Plot. It is a peaceful Halloween morning in Mount Airy, Maryland. Violette and William are walking downstairs for breakfast. A few minutes later Bill walks into the kitchen. 10 seconds later Violette hands Bill a bowl of candy corn cereal. A few seconds later Bill drinks his cereal. 10 seconds later Bill places his bowl into the sink. A minute later Bill says he wants to go trick-or-treating. Violette then tells Bill he is way too old. 2 seconds later Bill slaps Violette. A few seconds later Violette and Bill start fist fighting. 10 seconds later Violette walks away. A minute later Bill turns on YouTube on the living room TV. 10 minutes later Bill sees a video from a channel called J Station called Raising the Dead at 3 a.m. Bill then watches it. 12 minutes later Bill decides he should do it. A minute later Bill grabs some supplies he saw in the video. 10 minutes later Bill gets into his truck. 1 minute later Bill speeds away to get the remaining supplies. 20 minutes later Bill arrives at a store. 10 minutes later Bill drives off to a cemetery with all the supplies. A few minutes later Bill walks over to a random grave with supplies to raise a human from death, because he watched a J Station video about it. Bill wants to raise an entire cemetery to create his own undead army. A few minutes later Bill starts the ritual. 10 minutes later Bill finishes the ritual. 10 minutes later nothing happens. 20 minutes later Bill drives back home after the ritual turns out to be fake. A few minutes later Bill walks into the house. A few seconds later Violette says they are hosting a Halloween party. William then perks up. A minute later Violette and William make out a checklist for party supplies. A few minutes later Violette and the boys speed off to Party City. 30 minutes later Violette and the boys grab a shopping cart. A few seconds later Violette and William start walking around to get their necessary supplies. 20 minutes later Violette and the boys check out. A few minutes later they walk into a grocery store for party food and dinner. A few seconds later Bill runs off with 2 carts. 16 minutes later Violette and William pay for the groceries. A few seconds later Bill arrives at the checkout with 2 carts overflowing with very unhealthy food. A few seconds later Violette and William walk away. 2 seconds later Bill pushes his 2 carts over for no reason. A few seconds later Bill runs away. 2 minutes later Violette and William get into Violette's SUV. A few minutes later Violette and the boys speed home. A few minutes later Violette and the boys arrive home. They then start bringing in the bags of supplies and groceries. 5 minutes later Bill watches TV, while his son and wife unpack the stuff. 10 minutes later Violette and William finish putting away the food. A few seconds later Violette and William begin decorating the house with spooky decorations for the party. 10 minutes later Violette tells Bill he needs to put on his costume. A few seconds later Bill grabs his Donald Duck suit. 10 minutes later Violette and William set out the snacks and do final things to get ready. 20 minutes later the first guest arrives. 10 minutes later the final guest arrives. 2 minutes later Violette says the party officially begins now. 2 seconds later everyone cheers with excitement. A few seconds later everyone starts dancing. A few minutes later Bill starts screaming like a nut job. 2 seconds later Bill starts dancing like a lunatic. A few seconds later Bill starts screaming very inappropriate words. A few seconds later Violette starts cooking dinner for the party. 20 minutes later Bill walks into the kitchen. A few seconds later Bill starts hoovering the hors d'oeuvres. 10 minutes later Bill finishes eating all the hors d'oeuvres. 2 seconds later Violette announces that dinner will be ready in 5 minutes. 6 minutes later Violette and William set the entrees out. A few seconds later everyone grabs their portions. 2 minutes later Bill sees the food. A few seconds later Bill runs away. Violet then knows what is to come. A few seconds later Violet tells everyone to get ready for Bill's mass destruction. 10 seconds later Bill walks into the kitchen with a steel baseball bat. 2 seconds later Bill starts smashing up the entrees. 2 minutes later Bill starts destroying everyone's portion. 2 minutes later Bill walks away after destroying the living room decorations. 1 second later Violet screams with genuine anger. A minute later Bill walks into the living room. A few seconds later everyone starts nagging their brains out at Bill. 2 minutes later the nagging turns into arguing. 10 minutes later William starts crying because he hasn't had an uneventful Halloween for 7 years. A few seconds later the crazy neighbors call the police. 6 minutes later a police officer walks into the Anderson family household. A few seconds later the police stop the party. Violet then explains everything. 10 minutes later the party was officially ended by the police. A few minutes later the police and party guests leave. A few seconds later Violet and William start cleaning up after Bill's huge mess. 20 minutes later Violet and William finish cleaning up. A few seconds later Violet tells Bill he needs to be taught a lesson. A few seconds later William walks outside with 3 trash bags from Bill's not-so-secret chocolate stash. A minute later Violet runs the chocolate trash bags over. 10 minutes later Violet and the boys walk into the house. A few minutes later Violet and William start to finish decorating their house for their annual haunted house. 10 minutes later Violet and the boys watch TV. 2 hours later Bill asks if he can go trick-or-treating. Violet unwillingly agrees. A few minutes later Bill grabs a pillowcase for candy. A few seconds later Bill grabs a tool bag full of weaponry and construction tools. Bill then grabs a meat cleaver. A few seconds later Violet hands Bill a plastic toy knife. Violet then grabs the meat cleaver from Bill. A few seconds later Violette watches Bill walk outside. Violette then cries because she knows Bill is going to bring chaos and torment to Mount Airy. A few seconds later Bill walks over to the neighbor's house. A minute later Bill asks for candy. Then the neighbor walks inside her house while laughing. Bill then takes out a hammer. A few seconds later Bill smashes a window. He then sprints away. 3 minutes later Bill walks up to a mansion. He then rings the bell. A few seconds later someone comes out. 3 seconds later Bill gets the front door slammed in his face. Bill then screams with anger. Bill then takes out a pickaxe. A few seconds later Bill starts smashing up a Ferrari for no reason. 2 minutes later Bill sprints away. A few moments later Bill asks for candy from yet another house. Bill then gets scolded at. A few seconds later the house owner walks back into the house. A few seconds later Bill takes out a stick of dynamite. A few seconds later Bill places the dynamite in the homeowner's car. Bill then lights the dynamite up. Bill then finds cover. 10 seconds later the dynamite explodes. Bill then runs away. 10 minutes later Bill walks up to his 18th house. A few seconds later Bill takes out a flamethrower. Bill then lights a car on fire. A few seconds later Bill lights several trees on fire. 1 minute later Bill runs away. 8 minutes later Bill arrives at his 31st house. A few seconds later Bill takes out C4. A few seconds later Bill runs away after lighting it up. A few seconds later the people in the house run to the street. A few seconds later the house blows up. Bill then walks home. Meanwhile, Violette is watching TV. She then turns on the news. A few seconds later she sees a headline called "Rebel Teen in a Ghost Face Costume is Bringing Chaos to Mount Airy." Violette then sighs because she knows Bill is up to no good. A few minutes later Bill walks into the house while looking a little toasty. Violette then grabs Bill's tool bag. A few seconds later Bill sees the living room TV has the news running. Bill then starts panicking a lot. Violette then screams with pure anger. A few seconds later William walks downstairs. Violette then tells William to call the police. William then calls the police while Violette starts to whip Bill. 10 seconds later Violette grabs her electrical whip. She then starts whipping Bill. 20 minutes later Violette says they have to go to Safeway for a grocery run. Bill then walks out to his shed to grab his backpack full of C4. A minute later Violette and the boys speed off to Safeway. 8 minutes later Violette and William watch Bill speed into the Safeway with 2 grocery carts. A minute later Violette and William start filling their cart with stuff from a grocery list Violette made. 30 minutes later Violette and William pay for their groceries. A few seconds later Bill arrives at the checkout with 3 shopping carts overflowing with over $1,000 of unhealthy junk. Violette then tells Bill they already bought the groceries. 1 second later William says he will be putting the groceries into the SUV. A few seconds later Bill takes out a piece of C4 from his backpack. Violette then runs away. A minute later William finishes placing the 19 bags of groceries into the SUV trunk. A few seconds later Violette tells William to pull the fire alarm. A few seconds later Violette calls the police. 8 seconds later William tells a manager that his father has explosives. 10 seconds later the manager makes a call over the intercom saying this is not a drill. Someone in the Safeway has explosives. Everyone evacuate now, this is not a drill. I repeat, someone in the Safeway has explosives. Evacuate now for your safety. 1 second later another manager pulls the fire alarm. A few seconds later William sprints to the SUV. A few seconds later Violette tells William that the police, fire services and ambulances are en route. A few seconds later hundreds of patrons start evacuating the 12 establishments at the Mount Airy mini mall. A minute later over 100 cars begin to flee the scene. A minute later Bill is spotted. 1 second later Bill runs into another establishment. 10 minutes later Bill runs back into the Safeway with a fuse box connected to many wires. A few minutes later Violette and William get into the SUV. A few seconds later Violette and William speed to another parking lot. 2 minutes later the emergency services finally arrive. A few seconds later Violette tells the police officers everything. A few seconds later Bill walks out of the Safeway with a fuse box connected to 4 miles of wiring. A few seconds later Bill pulls the lever to his cord box. A few seconds later Bill runs for his life when the officers spot him. A minute later an explosion goes off. 1 second later Violette and William brace for impact. A minute later the police finish setting up a perimeter. A minute later 27 explosions go off simultaneously. 1 second later Violette and William start screaming while explosions go off. A few seconds later Violette starts crying and praying. A minute later 82 more explosions go off. A few minutes later the explosions finally stop going off. 1 second later Violette and William hug it out while crying. A minute later Violette looks out of a window to see they are stuck under some rubble. A few seconds later Violette calls the police. A few minutes later Violette starts crying. William then hands Violette some water and food. A minute later Violette and William start chatting. An hour later sunlight pours into the SUV. Violette then sees a person. 1 second later Violette screams. A few minutes later Violette and William are rescued. A few seconds later Violette sees a massive wasteland of rubble that used to be the Mount Airy mini mall. A few seconds later Violette checks her phone. A minute later Violette sees that Bill's act of terrorism is international news. A few seconds later Violette and William are greeted by men in news agencies. A few seconds later Violette and William start answering questions about Bill. 20 minutes later several FBI vans pull up. A few minutes later the presidential motorcade arrives. A few seconds later the President of the United States of America sees the real destruction. A few seconds later Violette and William meet with the President. A few seconds later they say they have put up with Bill's escapades for years. A minute later the President hugs Violette and William. 10 seconds later Violette and William start explaining everything that Bill did on national news. A few seconds later the broadcast goes all over the planet. A few minutes later the FBI says another set of explosions might happen again at a different mini-mall any moment. A few seconds later 8 massive explosions go off. 10 seconds later a 12-story apartment complex explodes. 1 second later the apartment complex falls to the ground. 1 minute later 18 random establishments blow up. A few minutes later Bill is found while placing TNT around a food pantry. A few seconds later Bill lights the TNT up. 1 second later Bill speeds away. 2 minutes later the food pantry blows up. A few seconds later Bill takes out a metal baseball bat from his pants. A few seconds later Bill starts smashing up a parking meter. 10 seconds later Bill gets placed in handcuffs. Bill then starts screaming curse words. A minute later Bill is driven away in an FBI van. A few minutes later the death toll comes out when the FBI confirms that 283 people lost their lives. A few seconds later Violette tells William she is dumping Bill during his trial against the world. A few minutes later Violette and William get into the president's limo. A few minutes later the president says to them that they can stay at the White House for the duration of the trial. The president then says he called MAHS so William was legally allowed to attend the trial. A few minutes later the motorcade arrives at the Anderson household. 20 minutes later Violette and William finish packing up for their short stay. A few minutes later the motorcade drives back to the White House. 2 hours later Violette and William get a small house to live in. A few hours later Violette and William head to bed. 3 hours later Violette and William walk into their new kitchen. An hour later they walk into the Oval Office, prepared for Bill's trial against the world. A few minutes later the president and Anderson family get driven to the Supreme Court of the United States. An hour later Violette and William see Bill is in a metal box with hundreds of feet of chains tying him down. A few seconds later Violette hands Bill her divorce papers. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill he is no longer a part of the Anderson family. A few minutes later Clarence Thomas comes to his podium. Clarence then says Bill's trial against the world has officially begun. An hour later an FBI officer is let up to the witness stand. 2 hours later the officer finishes talking. A few minutes later other victims, witnesses, family to the deceased victims and other people are led to give their side of the bombing. One family member victim says my 16-year-old daughter was using the restroom in the Safeway. She was trapped because the defendant put up a barricade in front of the restroom doors. Then the mini-mall collapsed. I accepted the realization that she was no longer here. A few hours passed while I was mourning the probable truth. Then I got a phone call from the biggest hospital in Washington, D.C. I answered it. I was told that she survived, and is currently in the ICU in a very critical state. Then I was told that she was going to surgery for an operation that needed to take place immediately. Then a few hours later I went to the hospital where my daughter was at. Then at 8 p.m., I was told that she died during surgery from the defendant's inhumane actions. I am devastated that I lost my daughter. I say the defendant is the most inhuman thing that just exists. 2 minutes later another victim says I was in the Safeway when the first explosion went off. I ran for my life, then another went off. I was at the entrance of the Safeway, about to escape, then 3 more explosions went off. Then I ran out of the Safeway. I was so fortunate that I survived. An hour later Violette and William start talking about their hands-on experience with Bill. 6 hours later Violette and William finish talking. A few seconds later Clarence says the trial is done for the day, and will finish off tomorrow. 20 minutes later Violette and William walk into their new house. A few minutes later Violette and William watch some Jawtooth while eating salad. A few minutes later Violette and William head to bed. 9 hours later Violette and William walk into the Oval Office. An hour later the second day of Bill's trial begins. Clarence starts the trial by showing a 5-hour video of footage that shows Bill's escapades. 5 hours later Clarence says it is time for Bill's sentence. Clarence then tells everyone that Bill is found guilty for committing terrorism on United States soil. A few seconds later Clarence sentences Bill to 20 years in ADX Florence in solitary confinement. Clarence then says that Bill will get the firing squad after his 20-year sentence is up. Bill then is allowed to speak. Bill says this country is going down the drain. The bleeping government. 3 hours later Bill is wheeled away while screaming super vile things, while being recorded on the news worldwide. A few minutes later Clarence says everyone is let out. Violette then tells William they are moving back to their house. William then smiles. An hour later Violette and William are driven back to their house via ride-share. 2 hours later Violette and William watch TV while enjoying some delicious salad. 3 hours later Violette tells William they are going to a buffet without her 421-pound former husband. 1 hour later Violette and William walk into the house to sleep. 12 hours later Violette and William speed off to MAHS. 2 hours later William graduates and is permitted to move on to senior year. Then Violette and William have wonderful lives. 20 years later Bill is executed via 10 people in a firing squad. The end. Conclusion. Hello there. I hope you enjoyed this Violette1st Halloween special. More stories to come. Bye for now.